Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am Talibita Moses. I am happy to be introducing to you a topic on environmental policies, laws, and ethics. And I, of course, apologize for us having taken this long, but of course, I know you appreciate that these are COVID times, and that is why we are trying to devise means of teaching using the digital spaces, or even using the private, or rather this digital migration is getting us to start conducting classes in ways that are different or abnormal. Now, it's incumbent on us to appreciate the definition of things like environmental policies. So the terms that we will be expected to introduce ourselves to, one of them is environmental, the other is policies, the other is law, and ethics. And every one of those will definitely have a definition for it, and we shall also have the different types and how it interfaces with the environment, and how it also brings about the needed conservation, but also the wise use of these natural resources. It's important for us to appreciate that natural resources are resources that are naturally occurring, or that if threatened, then they have environmental or devastating effects on humanity. So environment can be broken down into the various spheres. One of them is the hydrosphere. The hydrosphere is where, rather, that is involves water, the hydro in it, the hydrosphere. So the aquatic life, where we find, of course, there are animals and water species, of course, even vegetation. And environment can also manifest itself into the atmosphere, that is the gaseous form, and that is perhaps the oxygen that we breathe in, and the air spaces. And then we also have the lithosphere, which is the soil, the land, and that, of course, is the one that provides a habitat for plant and animal, and that, of course, generates food for us humans and the animals. And then the biosphere. The biosphere, of course, includes the flora, the fauna, and the others. Of course, at this point, I will invite you to, in your private research, to look for the definition of the environment, and then also research about the different laws that protect or define the different types of the environment. The examples I can give is, for instance, the hydrosphere, the Water Act, the biosphere, of course, the regulations. The National Environment Management Act has regulations that protect riverbanks and hilly areas. And then, of course, also for purposes of atmosphere, I give the example of the Tobacco Control Act, which, of course, protects the quality of air that people take in, if at all it's not being affected by tobacco products. So the other examples, I enjoin you to look for those examples so that we can have a better sense of what the environment and its regulatory framework entails. Now, it's also important for us to appreciate that Article 39 of the 1995 Constitution is the one that anchors our, or helps us concentrate on studying the environment and its protection. I will try to paraphrase it, that Article 39 of the 1995 Constitution, as amended, talks about the right to a clean and healthy environment. And that right to a clean and healthy environment is everybody's obligation, especially for us, the citizens and non-citizens, or visitors for Uganda, to ensure that there is environmental protection. And that's why, of course, talking to experts like you, it is important that our capacity is built to cause the needed environmental conservation. And of course, at this point, I know in the law enforcement, we have, for instance, the people who are engaged in the forestry, the National Forestry and Tree Planting Act, of course, establishes persons like those, the forest rangers. The Wildlife Act also introduces, or rather establishes, an enforcement arm of game rangers. The Fisheries Act also introduces fisheries enforcement officers, and the other examples, of course, you can name them. But also, you are aware that there's a court for people who are perhaps using utilities, using water without paying it, or stealing it, or delaying to pay bills. Of course, there's the utilities court, which is, of course, an express court, and it helps to punish errant persons or those that are not protecting the water resources. The other is the Petroleum the Petroleum Exploration and Production Act. Petroleum Exploration and Production Act, of course, also establishes institutions like the Petroleum Authority and the National Oil Authority. And of course, these, of course, also have institutions that are intended to protect the petroleum resources. And nobody is allowed to explore petroleum resources without a license. And you also need to be aware that there is Article 244, which talks about petroleum and hydrocarbon resources, or the natural gas, and it is government that is the custodian of those petroleum resources. And if any person is found exploring them without any license, such a person has contravened the law, and of course there are also penalties that will be visited on them. I thought with this explanation you will appreciate, of course, that the law can be defined in the Black's Law Dictionary, but also in the Concise Law Dictionary, as rules and regulations that are created by a higher authority, in the Ugandan case, Parliament, that is enforced among citizens with the sanctions or rewards for their breach. I am paraphrasing, but I will encourage you to look for the definition of law in the Black's Law Dictionary and the Concise Law Dictionary. There you'll find the definitions. That takes me to the process of how laws are made in the Ugandan instance. Of course, Article 79 of the 1995 Constitution imposes a duty on parliamentarians to make law for the development, peace of Uganda. Now, and of course, the Parliament of the Republic of Uganda is the one that makes law. However, in its parent act that it creates, it can delegate powers to an institution or a minister, for that matter. So that means the minister will definitely make what we either call a statutory instrument, or regulations, or rules. But those should not create institutions or aspects that have not been allowed by the parent act. If that ever happens, they will be challenged, and the minister would, in a way, would have usurped the powers of Parliament. So it's important for us to to find out what is the difference between an act, a bill of parliament, a regulation, a statutory instrument. I encourage you to look for the definition of those aspects: the act, the statutory instrument, the gazette, and the regulations. Which means in the subsequent classes we shall be trying to find out what those definitions of the same are. But like I did say, it is important for you to use the Black's Law Dictionary or the Concise Law Dictionary for you to get the actual definitions of the same. The other aspect I want to talk about is it's also important for you to look for the definition of the Constitution, and that is in Article 2, which calls it the supreme law of the land. It is the supreme law of the land that gives force to other sources of law. If there are any sources of law that are in conflict with the Constitution, it is the Constitution that prevails. And those other sources of the law, to the extent are in conflict, cannot prevail. So the other aspect, besides me talking about environment, I said that what we are going to be studying here is laws related to the environment, and that means we are looking at environmental laws. And as I had broken them, I said that for you to have a better appreciation of the various or the different categories of the environment that we are talking about, we look at the biosphere, which is the biodiversity. We look at the hydrosphere, which is water or aquatic life. We look at the lithosphere, which is land. Uganda has the Land Act. We have the Registration of Titles Act, and so on and so forth. I also talked about the National Forestry and Tree Planting Act. I also talked about the wetlands and hill areas regulations, and I also talked about the National Forestry and Tree Planting Act. Yes, the Petroleum Exploration and Production Act, and of course the Mining Act, and of course also things to do with wildlife, the Wildlife Act. That said, we will also be looking at policies. These are strategies or plans that are made by an institution or a body for it to achieve a greater goal. A policy, of course, we shall look for the actual definition. I encourage you to look for the actual definition, but it's important for us to know that, for instance, there is the National Oil and Gas Policy. And when we are talking about the policy, then we look at what year it was adopted. And of course, also, policies cannot be made by Parliament. Policies are made by ministries, departments, and agencies of government. And they are anchored, or they are drawn from what we call the national objectives and directive principles of state policy. And those, of course, also relate to the National Development Plan. I think now, as we speak, we are on National Development Plan 3. They are also carved out from things like the Sustainable Development Goals, the things like Vision 2040. All those fall in the category of policies or policy areas. Like I did say that when you want to know what policy does Uganda have on which resource, we go to the 1995 Constitution and we look for the national objectives and directive principles of state policy. They speak to food, to environment, to water, security, name them. And of course, also we have a policy on fisheries, we have a policy on forestry, we have a policy on the environment broadly. So, like I did say, again, those policies are made by ministries, departments, and agencies, which are called MDAs. And policies, like I did say, include strategic plans. And when we are talking about policy, we don't just talk about the policy, but we also talk about the institutional framework. The institutional framework, those are the ministries, departments, and agencies of government charged with the responsibility of conservation and also protecting the environment, but also encouraging people, persuading them, or promoting conservation through education, environmental conservation education, advocacy, and civic action, where citizens are mobilized either as individuals or as organizations through non-state actors. The other aspect is we are going to talk about environmental ethics. Environmental ethics, of course, are those I will expound on them. I want to end here, and I encourage you to respond to the questions that I did talk about. Let us prepare for the next class. I I will entertain questions. You can please write any questions or any areas that you'd really think I should have expounded more on. Thank you for giving me time today. You're welcome.